Go.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another day of SQL Bits. Thank you so much for joining our session today on Azure Cost Management. My name is Dustin Dorsey. This is my good friend, Denis McDowell, and we're so pleased that you joined us today. Hey, everyone. Thank you again for joining our session today on Azure Cost Management. Again, my name is Dustin. I'm here with Denis, and we're so glad that you're here with us today. So happy to be part of virtual SQL Bits this year. As much as we'd love to have been there in person, unfortunately, just for the sake of everything, we are virtual this year, but so thankful you're part of this. So a little bit about us before we kind of jump into the details here. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Dustin Dorsey. I am currently Director of Data Management for Lifepoint Health, based out of the U.S., out of Nashville, Tennessee, if you couldn't tell by my accent of talking here. I did want to share just a little bit of information there with you. Once we get done with this session, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me on any of those avenues. Would love to talk with you on there, or follow me on Twitter. Would love to connect with you, or LinkedIn on there. Denis, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Denis McDowell. I'm a principal solution architect with SentryOne. I've been with SentryOne for about a year and a half. Prior to that, I was in consulting and managed services. I've been doing this for a long time. But like Dustin said, if there's any questions or any follow-up required after this session, please feel free to reach out to one of us. It's a topic we're passionate about, and we can chew your ear off if you let us.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump into some things of why you're actually here today. You didn't come to hear about us, right? You came to hear about Azure Cost Management. So the agenda for today, so some of the things that we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the importance of a good Azure framework and governance and the role that that plays within Azure Cost Management. We're going to really focus on cost management within the Azure portal, and talk about things like cost analysis, budget alerting, and more. And then we're going to wrap it up with looking at some additional ways for you to save money on there. But before we go into any of those items, we want to spend a little bit of time just talking with you of why we think cost management is important. So you may be sitting there thinking of, I'm a technical guy, or I'm a developer, or I'm a DBA. It's not important to me. But within the cloud, it actually becomes very important for you. And we want to talk a little bit about that just in the beginning.
Yeah, that you're exactly right, Dustin. It is important for everyone to take cost into consideration, and it's an often overlooked aspect of the cloud. In fact, I've heard leaders, technical leadership at organizations I'm supporting, tell me I'm moving to the cloud to save money, and that's not always, really not often the case, particularly if the planning isn't done up front. It's not uncommon for organizations to move to the cloud in the most expensive way possible. Really because of a lack of planning or lack of insight into workflows, and then to pay to move items back, to repatriate back after they get a few invoices. So you can really blow through some budgets pretty quickly if you don't take this into account.
Yeah, it's not something you hear a lot about. The marketing materials that you get aren't going to really talk about a lot of the companies that are moving out of the cloud, but it's a very real scenario of, people have moved there and saw the cost skyrocket, and had to move out as a result of it. But it's not something that you necessarily hear a lot about.
It's great for the consultant who gets to move you twice.
Yeah, yep, exactly. So if you're asking, so from your perspective of why you should care, so the best way that I can sum this up is every architectural decision that we make in the cloud has a cost tied to it. So anytime you spin up a service, you scale a service, or you determine how you're going to structure your architecture of what you're building in the cloud, it comes with a cost. And that's not a cost that an accounting person down the hall from you is going to be able to come and present you with a list of here's what it's going to be. It's going to take the technical resource to be able to communicate those and to share those and look for various options that fit within those budgets.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the paradigm really shifts because the planning for these architectural decisions, the paradigm itself actually changes very much when moving from on-prem or in the virtual world into the cloud, where in the olden days, we purchased hardware with enough headroom for growth. That's not the case in the cloud. If you purchase headroom for growth in the cloud, you're paying for unused capacity. You pay for what you provision, not what you use. So you're exactly right, Dustin. It's something that often surprises organizations, and every single decision that you make will, in fact, have a cost associated with it.
Yeah, good point. All right, so introducing you to Azure Cost Management. So I want to show this slide here first. More what you'll see a lot of times in some of the marketing material that Microsoft will share with you, and I won't say, well, maybe marketing isn't the best word there, but just in terms of how they really kind of explain what they're trying to gather from Azure Cost Management. So when they've broken this up, if you go and you research this on, the Microsoft documentation, you're going to see a wheel here that's going to have three components. So they've kind of broken down Azure Cost Management into visibility, accountability, and optimization. I actually think there's an important fourth component in it called planning, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment that goes into this. But I want you to kind of have a feel for kind of what they're trying to accomplish within Azure Cost Management. So within cost visibility, it's making everyone aware of the financial impact the solutions have. Accountability, it's driving accountability throughout your organization so that you can stop bad spending patterns. And then cost optimization, which is evaluating your usage changes over times and being able to do more with less. And then, of course, the one that we've added, proper planning, which is more around just having good governance and doing your due diligence in terms of how you're structuring things. But just want you to kind of have a overview here of these are things that they were trying to accomplish within Azure Cost Management as we go through it. And then really what Azure Cost Management, if you could sum it up into a very simple term, it's really about avoiding surprises. So the reason we have this in there is to try to help from having having surprises when you get your bill in the mail when you get your bill or invoice at the end of the month.
That's right. One of the key benefits of moving to the cloud is that predictable, reliable spend, switching from CapEx or from to OpEx, and having those reliable monthly bills. You pay it like a utility. But if the planning isn't done up front and you don't have the visibility, it's not reliable, it's not consistent, and people will be surprised, and often are, by the costs.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so how do we plan? So what do we mean when we say planning on here? So the first component in here that I'll talk about is it's translating your architecture into estimates and understanding the cost implications. So this really starts with kind of building out an estimate through like a tool like the Azure Calculator, for instance, of going through and really understanding what you're moving and the impacts of the cost to be able to do that. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of detail going into there. I do have some information that is available out there. There's been a few presentations I've done specifically on that topic that you can check out online. But I do just want to note on here it's very important to make sure that you're not just going into the cloud and you're just building things willy-nilly, if you will. But it's important to understand what you're building and understanding the cost implications of that before you do it. If it's your first time moving to the cloud and you're just now getting started on it and you're not sure really what to expect, the best advice I can give you is start slow. Don't try to lift and shift your entire infrastructure at once, because that's oftentimes appetite for disaster. And a lot of the things that we were talking about before with people moving out is because they made these big leaps without having the skills on their teams to be able to really handle that. So if you're just getting started, move slow, move things, get an idea of kind of the cost implications of what you're moving, and it's going to give you a better opportunity to be able to build those budgets through tools like the Azure Calculator in the beginning.
And there are third-party tools as well that can help you with that. If and the very good Turbonomics brings to mind, that can assess your on-prem environment and translate that directly into what it will cost to move to the cloud. So there are other ways to do this, and Microsoft has a strong partner ecosystem to help with that as well.
Yeah, good point there, Dennis. All right, and then the second one is going to be good governance. So making sure as you're, building out the framework of your Azure environment, you have good governance in place. So cost management is part of governance when you think about governance, but there's also a lot of other points that make this up. And
Azure governance considerations. So governance is an often overlooked aspect of the cloud, and one of the really key takeaways from this is that you need to do it right from the beginning and have your governance and your conventions defined before you start for a number of reasons. First, it's going to help to control costs. It's going to reduce the amount of sort of wild west of your cloud environment in terms of naming conventions for things such as resource groups or virtual machines or applications. Um, Secondly, another reason this is important is that in many cases, it's difficult or impossible to go and redo these things. You have to build new in order to do it correctly. So it's very important that governance is defined at the front end of your cloud journey in order to avoid sprawl and inconsistencies in naming and things. So when we talk about, resource organization, things like resource groups, virtual networks, storage accounts, whatever those are, have those naming conventions defined and defined well, so that everybody is clear and you don't just have teams creating or people creating resources and creating their own naming conventions. We're going to talk a bit more about tags later on, but tagging is very important. It's a great feature, and it's really critical for resource organization. But again, define those tags, put governance around the tagging for the naming convention. So, for instance, one team may have a tag for SQL Server, another one may have SQL_server, and then trying to report on that and filter can become cumbersome. Um, Dustin, you want to talk about resource security a bit?
Yeah. So with resource security, you think about the principle of least privilege here. So one of the best things you can do to avoid bad cost decisions by being made is making sure you have proper security controls. So making sure that you limit the number of people who can go in and make those sorts of changes to people who are familiar with this. So best control for avoiding bad cost spend is just making sure you know who's actually able to do those things. And I'll echo kind of some of the things that you said on the resource organization too, Dennis. A naming convention is so huge. As we get into the cost analysis portion within the portal of being able to analyze your cost, there's several dimensions that live within there of resource and financial dimensions. And naming conventions really make that a lot easier to be able to navigate and view through that data.
Indeed, and I can speak from real world experience. When I was, I've consulted with a financial technology firm who um, we went in and did an audit of their Azure environment, and they had a tremendous number of just orphaned disks, storage, and there was no naming convention that tied it back to a VM, so nobody knew whether it was being used or whether it could be deleted. And there are real costs associated with those things. So that's one of the reasons it's important.
Yeah, good point. And then the other two things that kind of made up, I mentioned this before, but cost controls, cost management is an important aspect of Azure governance, which is what this session is on today, but also auditing, which doesn't necessarily play into the cost considerations, but it is an important aspect of Azure governance as well.
Ken, if you it can if you violate SLAs through a lack of auditing, then it can get very expensive.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Good point there. All right, so a little bit more about tagging. So Dennis kind of mentioned before the importance of this. So essentially, if you're not familiar with tags, what are tags? Essentially, tags are just metadata that can be added to an Azure resource. So if you spin up a resource, you can add a tag to it. When you get into Azure Cost Management and navigating through your cost, you're limited on a certain amount of dimensions that live within there of how you can filter and group the data. And really, it's financial or resource dimensions that exist within there. Tags become very important within there because what if there's additional things, additional information that you want to be able to group and filter your data by? And tags are a place that you can create those. You can create the sky's the limit in terms of how you can build those out. And we'll show you a few examples of kind of what we have put on there, but some examples may be like who the department is, for example, of if you want to assign a department to a resource for things like chargeback, who the owner would be. So if there's a specific owner within your organization who owns that, if it's a dev or prod, so what environment is it on or what application is it on? These are all things that you can utilize tags on your resources to be able to group it and really kind of dive through your financial data.
Right, the chargeback piece is very important as well, and it's one that really becomes difficult to get your arms around if you don't plan that up front. And I know that both Microsoft and Amazon are putting some real resources into tools that can help with that, so that you can do internal charge back to business units within your organization, or if you're in a multi-tenant environment, to external customers. But as of right now, tags really are the best way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so going a little more into kind of the Azure cost management, there's a few things we want to talk about really before we kind of get into the demos, just to kind of help make sense of these. One of the first things you're going to have to do when you go into Azure cost management is you're going to have to define a scope. So you may look at that at first and wonder, okay, what is a scope? Well, a scope is a node within the Azure resource hierarchy where Azure AD users access and manage services. So you can have, within that hierarchy, you can have multiple layers to it. So you can have billing accounts, management groups, resource groups, subscriptions, et cetera, that can make up that hierarchy. And it may vary depending on what sort of agreement that you have with Microsoft. For example, if you're under an EA agreement or you're under a cloud services agreement with Microsoft, you're going to see a little bit different items within that hierarchy. But we're not going to dive too much within to those. We're really going to focus on just from like a management group layer on down on those. But I do want to mention just within there, the scope is that where you set where you're going to view and be able to analyze your data at. Just to help paint a little bit better picture of this, rather than hearing me kind of fumble through trying to explain it without a diagram, this gives you an idea of kind of what I mean when I say Azure Billing Entity Hierarchy. You can see within here, you have a root management group, and then you've got various management groups, in this case, based on department. You've got one called production in there. And then you can have multiple subscriptions that live underneath those management groups. So management groups are just kind of containers that you can create and be able to drill up into multiple subscriptions on up. And you can have additional layers above those management groups, again, based on what sort of agreement you have. But each layer in here would represent a scope when you're going in and viewing that within Azure Cost Management. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the portal here, and let's actually dive through this a little bit rather than just hearing us sit here and talk about it. So I'm going to open that, and I'm going to go into the portal. So when you come in, you may come into the home page, or if you have a dashboard set up as your home page, you come in here and see it. You're going to want to look for a cost management. So if you don't see it in there, you can look for it in your services. Just type it in, cost management plus billing. It'll take you into it. I've got it up here in my recent services since I have used this. When you come into here, you'll see there's a place for you to create management groups. So if you need to structure management groups, we're not going to dive down that pathway very much today, but you can manage those. But we're going to go in here just to click on cost management, and you'll see it brings up various options within here. So cost management is really made up of 3 core components, because if we go back to kind of that circle that I showed you a little bit earlier, it kind of breaks down the different components that exist within there. So the first you have is analysis, so being able to analyze your cost. You have budgets that live within there, so it's a way to control your cost. And then you have optimizations, which is Azure Advisor and using recommendations that exist within there. For the first part, we're going to go in and we're going to look at cost analysis and dive through this a little bit. So I'm going to click over here just on cost analysis. I could have did it through the main page there. And I'm going to go in here and look at this. I'm going to drill up. You can see I'm going to go in here and I'm going to set my scope. So I've got my root management group. I can kind of dive through these all the way down to the resource group layer to be able to set these. But I'm going to do it just on the management group layer, which is just called group 1, just a dummy, just a simple management group that we have created in here. And you can see that it brings up some charts here that shows me what my current spend is. So by default, it's looking at my accumulated cost, and it has this set for the past from August 28th to September 27th, which may be the billing cycle in this case. Yep, looks like it's set to the invoice. I can come in here. I have several date functions, so I can go in here. I can set a custom date range, or I can look at the last 7 days, or really be able to break it down on whatever sort of time frame that I wanted to be able to see within here. And then over here, I've got various sorts of ways that I can group. So when I was mentioning dimensions before, these are the dimensions that exist to allow you to be able to go through and navigate through your data. So for instance, if I want to come in here and look at a service name, for instance, of resources that I have up and that I'm spending on, I can change this to resources and I can break that down and see within the last 7 days, in this case, where am I spending the most amount of money. I can also change the granularity. So if I want to look at it on a monthly, or in this example, I'm going to switch it to a daily basis. I can look at my cost and I can train it on a daily basis. And if I want to change the type of chart that I'm looking at, I can go and change it between a line or a column or a table, which table in this case would be the raw data. So you can get raw data if you want to do some of your own stuff or export it out to Excel. But I'm going to change this to a stacked column. And so this kind of shows you, and it looks like we're pretty consistent on our spend from day to day, but I can come in here and be able to analyze different costs on here. Another option is, again, various resource and financial dimensions that exist within there that you can go through and navigate it. But one that I want to specifically highlight is around tagging. So we talked about the importance of tagging before and the ability to be able to do chargebacks, and how tagging really opens up a whole new dimension, if you will, in terms of being able to filter and navigate and look through your data. I'm going to go ahead and click this on the group by, and you can see that we've got 4 tags that are assigned to our resources. So application, environment, owner, and reason. I'm going to change this to owner. Owner is it's a tag that we added to the resources. We just attached an owner to it. And now you can see in here, we've gotten 3 owners. So there's Billy Bob, there's Dustin, and there's Dennis. And we can evaluate cost here based on individual owners. We can also dive through these. So let's say in this case of Dustin, we want to see where Dustin's spend is. If I click that, it will add a filter up there to it. So it'll filter all of the data based on just tags where the owner is Dustin Dorsey. And I can use these charts in the bottom, which will also update anytime I do any sort of filtering or grouping to be able to see where it is. So I could see for Dustin, most of his cost is getting spent on storage, but he is spending a little bit of cost on SQL databases as well within there, as well as looking at the various regions. And if I had different subscriptions in here, because remember I'm under a management group, I can have multiple subscriptions underneath there. I could break the cost down between various subscriptions on there to be able to look at it.
Microsoft shareholders will be very pleased with our spend here.
Yes. Yeah, you can see, yeah, just to kind of highlight that, we are, in order to be able to do these demos, you have to spend money to be able to do them. So because it is money that, in this case, Dennis is paying, I guess, or maybe his credits is being applied to, we don't want to go crazy on it. So I'm not going to show you thousands of dollars worth of spend in here. So you're getting $30.
That does highlight. You can get very granular here, and it can become quite complex,
Yes.
particularly when you talk about storage and network egress and other costs. So while this is a simplified view of it, it's really very rich in data, and I would highly recommend organizing this and using it.
Yeah, absolutely. There are some built-in views as well that you can use in here, but you can also create views. So if this was a view right here that I wanted to be able to continuously come in and look at, or if there was a specific service that I was tracking, or another specific tag that I wanted to track, you can save these views either as a private by clicking that, or just call it whatever if you want it to be available for everyone who accesses this. So you can save those. You can share these. So there's a link you can share with others. Back in here. That you can share with others. You can also go in and you can download those. So if you want to download those and be able to send those over to, leadership or so, and say, here's what our current spend looks like, you can certainly do that. Kind of glad that reset, because there's one other component here that I wanted to mention to you. When you're looking at this, like on a monthly view, for instance, you can see it will forecast your spend out. So we are recording this on September 11th today, and you can see it kind of estimates my cost out based on current trends of where we would end up at the end of the month. So if we continued running at the current pace, it would estimate us being about $306 by the end of the month, but today we're at $65. So you can break that out. You'll also see there's this little dotted line right here because we have a budget configured to be able to navigate this. And we'll talk a little bit about budgets and what those mean here in just a moment to be able to look through the cost. One other thing, or maybe two other things that I want to mention on this. The first thing is around currency. So most of you guys attending are probably located within Europe, being as we're at SQLBits. So US dollars aren't going to probably mean a whole lot to you, especially if you're specifically just based out of Europe and do business within Europe. If you are working with currencies and you're being billed in multiple currencies, you can select this little drop down here. And there will be an option in here. You don't see it on ours because we're US based and it's we're paying with US dollars. But if it were where we were paying in euros, for example, you would see an option under here for currency to be able to change the currency to a different currency. You also see underneath here this metric, this actual cost versus amortized cost. Amortized cost is really going to only apply if you're using Azure reservations. And we'll talk a little bit about reservations at the end. But essentially what it is, it's a commitment to Microsoft over a spend. And an amortized view makes that commitment and those credits, it spreads it out over the course of a period of time as opposed to just looking at it in one fell swoop. But we'll talk a little more about that. And then the last thing to note on this specific screen would be that when you are analyzing your data within cost analysis, just know that this data is not real time. It does come in at about a 4-hour lag, so it's about a 4-hour delay. So if you have something and you come in here and you notice something shooting up, getting really high, just know you're about 4 hours from what your actual spend is on that at any period of time. I do expect that to get narrower. But if you look back at the history and knowing where we come from with some of the previous tools, data was up to a day or more behind. So that gap has been narrowed significantly from what it used to be. But just want you to know that that data that you're looking at there is about 4 hours behind. All right. Any additional thoughts from you on that, Dennis, before we kind of jump back into?
Honestly, Dustin, no, I think you covered it really well. That one thing I would highlight, is back to the original question about why should a SQL DBA, need to know this. And one thing I can tell you is that consistently what I've seen in the field is that these SQL, your database workloads are consistently the most expensive within an organization. And it's often the DBAs or the DBA team who are asked by their manager or the director of IT, why are we spending so much money? So this screen, these views are really important because you can drill down into which instances or which SQL databases are using resources, and we'll talk in a bit about things like workload optimization. But this just again highlights why it's important for a DBA to know this, and this is a critical tool to help give you the insight and really add value for your organization.
Yeah, excellent point. All right, let's hop back over to the slides. So just some quick hits here. These are things we just spoke about within here. So some of the cost analysis features of some of the things that you can do within it. Just in word form there for you. We won't go back through those. One thing I guess I didn't mention, you cannot currently go in there like a report and set up a subscription like you can like think of SSRS or Power BI, where you have an emailed report out to a user on a scheduled basis. That functionality doesn't exist today, but I imagine it would be coming at some point where you can just email out reports on a scheduled time frame. But you can go in and schedule exports out to blob storage, and you can pick up those files from blob storage and email those out. So if that's something you're interested in doing, your leadership wants a copy of your current spend on a once-a-week basis, that is a way that you can set that up. All right, so how to use cost analysis. These are some things that I put together of when I'm going through and analyzing this data, of questions that I like to ask myself and to look at it. So the first thing is looking at actual cost versus budgeted cost. So we talked about the importance of planning that goes into this beforehand, and like using tools like the Azure calculator to go in and build your cost estimates and your budgets. An important aspect of this tool is once you get in there and running, You're probably not going to hit it, nail on the head of your estimate versus the actual, but going in there and evaluating those and seeing where did I go off? What is different? Am I spending more in a certain area than maybe what I originally thought? Learning from that and also adjusting to it. Investigating anomalies. So how am I trending? Is there anything unusual? If I'm looking at this over a period of a month, is there any large spikes in there from a spend from one of the services that I'm managing that I may need to go investigate? Was there a change that I made that caused a big influx in spend that maybe I wasn't expecting? It's a great tool, as Dennis mentioned before. It's a great tool to go in there and be able to discover those things that maybe you didn't kind of expect it to happen, but it did. Invoice comparison. So comparing 1 month, the current month from the last month, and understanding if if there's a variance between it. Why is there a variance? Was there something new introduced? Did we remove something? Did the cost drop? Did I expect the cost to drop because maybe I retired a service and it didn't? Maybe it indicates that there's something that's still remaining within there. And then the last thing is internal chargeback. So Dennis alluded to this a little bit earlier, and I'll let him talk about it a little bit more. But how should your charges be broken down for your organization? So if you're doing internal chargeback, tagging is a great way to be able to do that throughout the tool. But Dennis, you want to add some color there?
Sure, yeah, and I would say internal or external. If you're a managed service provider or a multi-tenant environment and you're billing your customers, currently, natively, I should say, tagging is the way to do it. And you would create tags that would define the business unit internally or the external customer to whom the charges will be passed along. So it really is critical in an organization because it can be very difficult, particularly in large organizations or managed service providers, to allocate a single budget for IT and then try to parse that out amongst customers based upon their consumption. And this is all consumption based. That's really key for cloud. And also, if I may, back to actual versus budgeted cost, that's really critical, especially when you're signing enterprise agreements with Microsoft and trying to extrapolate what that cost is going to be, and you get a discount for a 3-year spend. And I have seen, again, customers I supported who didn't pay attention to actual versus budget and blew through the first year's budget within 6 months. So these are all tools that are really critical to planning and staying on track and providing the insight required to show where to devote your resources to optimize the cloud spend.
Yep, good points. All right, one of my favorite things.
Performance tuning. I can't imagine that we have a SQL conference and people don't want to talk about performance tuning. And the first thing what I'll start with is know your workload. And I say that in SQL Server Consulting, and I say that in, cloud management. It's amazing to me sometimes when I see large organizations who understand individual resource consumption at the server or the instance level, but they don't have a broader understanding of their workloads and the patterns. So again, back to the earlier point that every decision we make costs money. Performance tuning, optimizing those SQL workloads or problematic queries, or every bit of performance that you can squeeze out of your resources will save you money. And because we're running hotter in the cloud, whereas on-prem you may have used 60% of compute utilization as your benchmark before you would upsize, it's not uncommon to see sustained values of 70 or 80% in the cloud because you want to optimize that spend. So again, every little bit of performance tuning that you can squeeze out of your environment is going to put off increasing costs. Okay, and what you see up on the screen here, if you're not familiar with it, is SentryOne's SQL Sentry Plan Advisor or Plan Explorer, which is a free tool, free download, and it is really the standard at this point, the gold standard for evaluating query plans and seeing where you can optimize queries, what's going on internally. So if you haven't downloaded it, go to SentryOne.com and download Plan Explorer. I think you'll be glad that you did.
Yeah, one other thing on proactive performance tuning that I want to mention, and this is one of my favorite things about doing this, within using cost management within the cloud is a visual representation of changes that you've made. So if I go in, for instance, and I tune a server within the cloud, and I'm able to reduce that server from an 8-core to a 4-core, and I'm able to go through and scale that down, I can go to those cost analysis and I can show you where I've saved the organization money. So in previous companies where I've worked, proactive performance tuning, just because we were a small team, wasn't something we had a lot of time to spend to be able to do. It was more reactive performance tuning. Something was broke and happening. But within the cloud, that kind of changes because proactive performance tuning, you're going to see an immediate cost savings from that when you make those changes if you can scale those resources down. Whereas on-prem, that cost has already been spent. So yes, while you may be able to reduce licensing and you may be able to reduce resources, you're not getting money back in your pocket at that point. But with doing it in the cloud, I can save the organization money and I can show it through tools like cost analysis, which is an amazing thing.
Yeah, and nobody's career's ever suffered because they showed somebody how to save money.
Exactly. All right. So moving along into cost management. So we want to talk a little bit about budgets next. So budgets allow you to track your spending against budgets. So things that you've created, such as what you've built through tools like the Azure Calculator or estimates that you've created, and create accountability against those. And you can utilize budgets to do things like you can just have it trigger an alert within the portal. You can have it also automate different actions, and we'll show you some of those here in just a moment. So I'm going to kick back to the demo that I was showing before, and I'm going to come over here into cost management. You're going to see there's an option in budgets. So I'm going to go into budgets here. And I'm going to change my scope just because of permissioning down to the subscription level, which is just our pay-as-you-go subscription. And you're going to see within here, I've already got a handful of budgets created within here. So I've got a dev budget, a budget for calendar month, and I've got a production monthly budget that already exists within here. You can see the numbers that I have tied to those expiration dates. And then you can see a progress over on the right-hand side. So you can see on a couple of these budgets I have created, we've already went over our spend on those, and on our production monthly budget, where we're kind of in the middle there. So you can analyze existing ones, but I want to walk you through actually creating one. So if you come within here to create a budget, you can go in and you can set the scope. Again, I'm going to leave this just set at this, but you could set it on a measurement group layer or on a resource group layer. You can add some filters in there. So if you want to be able to filter it, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and filter it because I want to create a monthly budget for owner Dustin Dorsey. So I'm going to go in here. Again, we can use tags. I'm going to set it to owner. And I'm going to say for Dustin Dorsey. And we're just going to call this one Dustin's budget. I can set how often I want that to be done. So I can billing month or monthly or quarterly calendar months for those. Or if I have a separate, my billing month is different or my quarters or so are different, but I'm just going to do it based on month. You can set the creation date or expiration date. So if you're building your budget out for the next year, you can go in and you can add your components within there. And then you set a budgeted amount. So when it loads, it will give you a suggested budget based on your current spend in there. I'm just going to go ahead and just throw something in here and call it $20. And you can see within here, it automatically will add a line in there for it to show where my current spend is versus where my budget item is as well. So you kind of get a visual representation as you're building it out of what it looks like. The next thing you do is you go in and you can create alerts on here. So you have to either create an alert condition or an alert recipient within here. So I could just have this send me an email. So just, hey, when you hit a certain threshold, let's call it 80%, send me an email. Or I can call an action group within here, which opens up a lot of different opportunities for me. Currently, I just have one action group created in there because you can also create action groups to email. But you can also do other things with an actions group. And I'm going to open these up and just quickly show these to you. So when you come in here, I'm going to skip past all the little basic details that we go into it. And I'm just going to go over here to actions because these are the actions that are performed as part of an action group. When I click this, you can see I have a lot of different options within here. Automation runbooks, Azure Functions, ITSM, Logic Apps, webhooks, and so forth in there. So I can do a lot of other things besides just sending an email. An option, SMS, voice text, but I can do things like automation runbooks. which is something that I personally use fairly often within our budgets, so that when I hit a certain threshold on a budget, I can scale down a resource, or I can shut down a resource, or I can perform actions associated within those to be able to do things. So my spend doesn't get too crazy, but it also doesn't require someone to be staring at these charts 24 hours a day or looking at these periodically. I can use these budgets to actually go through and be able to manage actions within these. So I'm going to slip back over here to this. You can create multiple. So if you want to have a different action happen at 90%, a different action happen at 100%, you can go through and create various actions that exist on there. When actions are performed, you will notice this thing over here called cost alerts. When you do look at that, cost alerts are just actions that have been performed because of a budget. So if you go into cost alerts and you hit add to create a new budget, or create a new alert, it's essentially just going to create a new budget. And then the last thing I'll mention here, I know we have several things, so there's several additional things we want to go through before we run out of time here, is when you come in here and you look at your cost on here, you can select the budgets that you have within here and it will show up on this chart. So let's go through and look at based on the month, and let's hope it works. Yep. So you can come through here and you can kind of trend your budget of whatever you've created based on this by selecting that. One other important note that I'll make on here is if you do change it based on a daily basis, you'll notice that it will change my, sorry, right here is what I meant to select, my granularity to daily. On here, it will change my daily budgeted cost. So it'll go through and refactor it from what it was. It'll scale it down to a daily number as opposed to looking at a monthly basis. So if you want to break it down, analyze it on a day-to-day basis, you can go through and cost analysis and compare your current spend with budgets that you do have created. All right, I'm going to jump back over to the slides. Yeah, again, just on the list of action groups, these are the various action groups that you can go through and run on here. Run books is something that as a DBA you may be interested in by scaling or being able to shut services down if you hit a certain amount. ITSM may be another one, so that's where you can integrate within tools like ServiceNow or be able to create tickets within those that happen. And of course, good old trusty email, just getting email alerts through those.
That's right, and you can get very rich with these. Looking at ITSM and thinking about something like PagerDuty, if it was a critical, a critical event where somebody needs to be awakened. I can't imagine that would happen for cost, but it's conceivable that it could. Where if you hit a certain resource utilization, webhooks or APIs with the popularity of observability platforms like Grafana, where you could, have that data ingested or presented through your observability platform so that you have dashboards for various business units or personas within your organization. So it's a really cool feature and it's probably underutilized, but I think you get very rich, very granular with this, and it could be a very powerful tool.
Yeah, good point. The next thing I want to tell you, so when we talk about optimizations within Azure Cost Management, really what it's talking about is the Azure Advisor. So I'm not going to show a demo of this because our spend is pretty low. We don't really have any recommendations on improving spend because we're not really spending very much. But the Azure Advisor in there, if you do have a large amount of spend, will give you recommendations on things that you can do to go and decrease your spend. So if there's waste associated within there, or if there's an opportunity to utilize other programs that exist, it will give you recommendations based on those. If you've been in the cloud for a while and this is something that you've never gone and looked at, I would highly recommend that you go and just check out the recommendations that exist in there. Just like with performance tuning, you're not going to go through on some automated query tuning that's going to recommend every index to you. You're probably not going to take it as the gospel. But use this, take those recommendations. Don't just necessarily say, yep, I'll take it, I'll take it, I'll take it. Evaluate those and really look at those to see if it makes sense for you. But there are great suggestions that do show up in the Azure Advisor, and there are specific ones just to costing.
And Microsoft is putting a lot of energy in this as well. And I see this tool continue to evolve and become more useful and informative. So to Dustin's point, use this tool and keep an eye on it because they are putting resources into improving the functionality.
Yep. A few other quick hits as we kind of wrap up here. Just know that this tool is a multi-cloud tool. You can utilize Azure Cost Management if you are currently also using AWS. It is 1% of your total cost, so it does come with a cost, whereas if you're an Azure user, Azure Cost Management is actually free. But you can utilize this if you're working in a hybrid cloud environment to be able to monitor your spend in other platforms. GCP is currently on the roadmap. It's not available yet, but I would expect that to probably become available here pretty soon. And then if you want to be able to build some of your own reports and you want to go in and you want to navigate this data yourself and do some things that maybe you're limited to by Azure Cost Management within the portal, you can connect Power BI to this. So it does natively connect. You can see the screenshot over there where you go in to get data and you can go in, you can connect it into Azure Cost Management, and you can go and build whatever to your heart's content that you want to build within there. You also, if you're not a Power BI user and you don't have Power BI available, all of the data, your cost management data, is available via APIs, open APIs that you can go and connect and pull that. So if you want to build your own application and be able to go in there and connect to it and navigate it, you can certainly do that as well. So, all right, jumping to the last thing. So here's just some quick tips that we want to just share with you that you can use to help lower some of your costs. So if you are within Azure today and you're trying to manage your costs and you're looking at ways to decrease your spend, these are some things that we believe can help you. First thing, Azure reservations. So you heard us kind of mention this a little bit before when we were talking about the amortized view that you were looking at within there, and you may have even noticed reservations listed when we were just looking at cost management within there over on the sidebar. What Azure reservations are, they're a commitment of between 1 to 3 years of a spend to Microsoft, where you come and say, we're going to spend X amount over the next 1 to 3 years. And as a result, you're going to give us cost savings associated with that. That can get pretty significant. Azure reservations, you can completely manage those yourself via the portal. So you can go in there and you can create those and modify those as you do it. Just know we don't have a tremendous amount of time today to be able to dive into all the details. There are a few caveats to it, so make sure you really understand those before you go through and dive through those. But I will tell you this, they're generally best for 24/7 predictable workloads. So if you have predictable 24/7 workloads, I would highly recommend going in and looking at those because it can save you a lot of money. The next one is Azure Hybrid Benefits. So Azure Hybrid Benefit is the ability to be able to take your Windows and your SQL licenses to the cloud. If you have software assurance, that's a big if there, so you have to have software assurance. If you have licenses on-prem and you're moving servers to the cloud and you have software assurance, this is a no-brainer. There's really no catches in there with it. You want to take advantage of this benefit because, or else you're paying for those licenses twice. And as we all know, SQL licenses are not cheap. So definitely take advantage of that benefit. Managing runtime hours and scaling. So what we mean by this is if you're running services within there and there's times that they aren't needed, shut those bad boys down. If it's like a VM and you're only running it during business hours, shut it off in the evening so you don't have to pay for that expensive compute cost. Computing is one of your most expensive resources that you're going to pay for within the cloud. So being able to shut things down is going to give you a big boost in terms of scaling down your cost. Some services, so you got a thought there, Dennis, but some services I will say, like Managed Instance or Azure SQL DB, you can't shut those down. Scaling those down to a lower service tier could be important to do kind of in those off hours.
That's right. Yeah, you can use this to schedule either to trigger growth by either on a schedule or compute utilization, and consider some of those workloads as quarterly reporting workloads that in the olden days we had to buy capacity for that, even though it ran 4 times a year. In this case, you could run it one tier for most of the time and then scale up. So it again gets back to knowing your workload, but this is a tremendous benefit and tremendous advantage in the cloud.
Absolutely. And then real quickly, look for waste. So if there's services, it's easy to go in and spin something up in the cloud and forget it was there. Look for things that may be running costs. Again, cost analysis is a great tool for this, of going through and evaluating of, oh, shoot, I forgot to, go in and remove that service that I only needed for a quick thing or so forth. One big thing that I've noticed here, just within people that has contributed to a lot of waste, is when you create like an Azure VM, you think if you just go through there and delete the VM that it removes everything, but it doesn't. There's extra components that you have to go through and remove, like specifically storage. So if you just delete the VM and you forget about it, you're probably still paying for some of those storage costs.
And that ties back to the the naming conventions and all. And at times when I've worked with organizations that have a ton of orphaned virtual disks with no real way to tie them back to a VM, so they're not sure if it's being used or not. So that gets back to the planning and governance at the front end.
Sure. Yep. And then the last thing that I'll mention here is utilizing dev test pricing. So if you are a Visual Studio subscribers and you have those licenses, you could get a huge cost decrease for using dev test pricing. This is pricing that is applied on the subscription layer. So it's very common to see people split up their production subscriptions from their dev subscriptions. And the reason they do that is because on the dev subscription, you can utilize dev test pricing, which does give you a huge cost advantage in terms of your cost there. And then actually one more. The last thing that I'll mention here is on shared resources. So if you're using Azure SQL DB, you can use things like elastic pools to try to mitigate the number of resources that you need. So take advantage of places where you can look at sharing resources, sharing instances, et cetera, to pull things together so you don't have them so spread out, and really be able to maximize the resources that you have there. And with that, I think we are about out of time. So I'll say thank you. Denis, any closing thoughts?
No. Well, yeah. Just that this is, when earlier in my career, this was the kind of topic that caused me to roll my eyes when my manager sent me to it. And it, I wanted to stay in the tech and the query tuning and the all the cool stuff. But I can say that my own career has benefited mightily from having a good leader who made me do this and paying attention to these things. So. As the role of the DBA and the data professional expands within organizations, I would encourage you to spend some time learning this, and you and your organization will see benefits from it. But Dustin, thank you for giving me the opportunity to sort of ride along on your coattails on this. I'm grateful.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Denis. Appreciate it a lot. So, yeah.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Bye now.